Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's joint meeting of the Ethics and Oversight and Labor Committees. I'm excited to share the gavel today with my friend and colleague from the 44th District, Chair Hadsma, to hear from the Auditor General's Office and the Unemployment Insurance Agency, which is housed within the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. Both will focus on the December 2023 Auditor General Performance Audit on fraud and investigation activities. As a note to committee members, the Auditor General's team and UIA will be speaking to this specific audit only from December of 2023. We will begin with a presentation from the Auditor General's office, after which members will have time to ask one question each. Then we will have a presentation from the Unemployment Insurance Agency, after which members will have time to ask one question each. If time allows, additional questions may be asked. And due to the fact that an appropriations meeting will be taking place in this room immediately following our joint meeting, we will need to be conscious of time. So with that, the House Committee on Ethics and Oversight will come to order. Will the clerk please take the attendance?
Chair Burns.
Here.
Representatives Hope. Here. Green. Churches. Present. Hoskins. Wogella.
Here.
Koontz.
Here.
Wozniak. Harris.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have 6 members present. You do have a quorum.
Thank you. And Representative Hope moves to adopt the meeting minutes from the April 18th, 2024 meeting. And hearing no objection, the minutes are adopted. Representative Hadsma?
Thank you, Chair Burns. Would the House Committee on Labor please come to order, and the clerk please take attendance?
Chair Hadsma.
Here.
Representatives Menser.
Here.
Colazar.
Here.
O'Neill. Andrews.
Here.
Churches. Wogella. Wozniak.
Still here.
Mueller.
Here.
Koontz.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Might I now have a motion to adopt the minutes from the April 18, 2024 meeting? Representative Churches makes that motion. The minutes are adopted. Thank you. I will now welcome Brian Weiler, the Audit Division Administrator, and Chad Munger, the Principal Audit Supervisor from the Office of the Auditor General, to present to us their report. Gentlemen, good morning.
Good morning, Chair Hadsma. Thank you. Good morning, Chair Burns and respective committee members. As Chair Hadsma said, my name is Brian Weiler. I'm an Audit Division Administrator in the Auditor General's Office, and with me this morning is Chad Munger. Chad supervised this audit from December of 2023 on UIA's investigation activities, fraud and investigation activities. Chair Burns and Chair Hadsma, if it's okay, we have about a 10 to 12 minute presentation of the report that we'd like to read, and then we're of course happy to try to answer any questions that you may have following that. I'll begin with some background information, and Chad will then summarize information from each of the findings in the report. As indicated in the report summary on the first page, and then again on page 8 in the background section, this was the 5th and final of a series of audit reports on UIA's operations at the onset, during, and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Although there is some overlap in the time frame for these audits and the population of claims that we selected for our audit testing, each of these 5 audits had unique audit objectives. The first 4 audits focused on UIA's efforts to manage personnel at the onset of the pandemic, establish eligibility for the newly formed federal assistance programs, process claims, and its internal controls over its IT system, the Michigan Integrated Data Automation System, which is commonly referred to as MIDAS. This audit primarily focused on selected efforts of UIA's Investigations Division to identify and investigate potential claimant fraud during and after the pandemic. In addition to the issues noted in this report, we had also identified several internal control deficiencies in our January 2023 report on claims processing, which impacted UIA's overall fraud detection and prevention efforts, but we did not include those in this report. We use terms like imposter fraud and intentional misrepresentation throughout this report in the various findings, and we define these terms in the background section on page 8 and again in our glossary on page 36. In a nutshell, imposter fraud involves those claims filed with stolen identities, And intentional misrepresentation is just that, an act of willful misrepresentation or non-disclosure of a material fact for the purpose of obtaining benefits to which the claimant is not entitled. Several times in these series of reports, we have acknowledged the unprecedented circumstances that resulted from the global pandemic and the significant spike in unemployment claims, and the challenges UIA encountered in standing up the CARES Act federal programs. Our intentions have been to focus on UIA's internal controls and identify where UIA can make improvements to continue to respond to the circumstances that developed during the pandemic, ensure compliance with state and federal laws, and to be prepared for future unexpected events. Our audit period for this final report covered January 1 of 2020 through December 31 of 2022. We had one audit objective, and it was to assess the sufficiency of UIA's efforts to identify and investigate potential claimant fraud. Our conclusion for this objective was UIA's efforts were not sufficient, and we identify the factors that support our conclusion on page 9 of the report. Those factors consisted primarily of the material and reportable conditions in the 4 findings that Chad will summarize here in a moment. UIA's preliminary responses to the 4 findings in the report indicate some level of agreement with all of the recommendations and varying degrees of corrective action that UIA had implemented at the time we released the report. Michigan compiled laws and administrative procedures require UIA to develop a corrective action plan to the recommendations in the report and submit that to the state budget office upon the issuance of the report in December. With that, I will now turn it over to Chad, and he will provide a summary of the information from the 4 findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to the respective chairs and the committee members. The first finding, which begins on page 10, relates to our review of the monetary penalties UIA assessed on claims it determined involved claimant intentional misrepresentation. The MES Act, the Michigan Employment Security Act, provides that UIA should recover the fraudulent claims and assess monetary damages, and the U.S. Department of Labor, USDOL, issued guidance in May 2021 requiring states to assess a monetary penalty of at least 15% to fraud-related overpayments for the CARES Act programs. During the audit period, UIA issued approximately 3,200 determinations of intentional misrepresentation, totaling $16.9 million in principal, and assessed fraud penalties of $5.6 million. We reviewed a random sample of 25 of those intentional misrepresentation determinations and noted that UIA had not assessed or incorrectly assessed fraud penalties on 84% of the determinations and had undercalculated fraud penalties by at least 49%. This was mostly in part due to UIA not programming MIDAS to allow for the assessment of the required fraud penalties for the CARES Act programs implemented during the pandemic. As noted on page 11, UIA first attempted to update the related programming in MIDAS to correct this issue in March 2022, but informed us it had not completed the necessary changes as of December 2023, due to resource constraints and other priorities. Similarly, UIA had not yet addressed internal control deficiencies that precluded it from addressing potentially fraudulent pandemic unemployment assistance, PUA, overpayments previously estimated by Deloitte in December 2021 at $5.6 billion, which, if applying the 15% monetary minimum penalty, would equate to an additional $840 million in penalties. We recommended UIA address the programming issues in MIDAS to help ensure it accurately assesses fraud penalties on claims in which intentional misrepresentation occurred. The second finding, which begins on page 12, relates to our review of UIA's efforts to identify the imposters and make appropriate referrals for those claims in which UIA determined that claimant identity theft or imposter fraud occurred. As noted on page 12, the MES Act requires that when UIA identifies an imposter claim, it shall attempt to recover unemployment benefits paid to the imposter. USDOL also provided guidance to the states in August 2021 that clarified and required states to refer for potential fraud to USDOL's Office of the Inspector General under certain circumstances. And UIA can also refer a suspected fraud to the State Department of Attorney General. During the audit period, UIA identified imposter fraud in approximately 19,000 claims, totaling $106.3 million. As indicated in parts A and B on page 12, UIA's investigation division had not attempted to identify who submitted the claims in approximately 70% of the claims in our sample, or recover payments and assess fraud penalties for 97% of the claims in our sample. In addition, the investigation division did not make referrals to USDOL or the Attorney General for most of the claims in our sample. As noted on page 13, the investigation had not established procedures to identify the factors its staff should consider when deciding the extent of its fraud investigation efforts, or to document the rationale within the investigation notes to support their decisions. We also noted on page 13 that UIA can still attempt to identify who submitted imposter claims, make referrals to law enforcement, and attempt the recovery of those fraudulent payments and related penalties. Pending the passage of ongoing federal legislation, there could be additional financial incentives for states in the future to recover fraudulent overpayments. The third finding, which begins on page 14, relates to improvement opportunities for UIA's claim data analysis procedures to identify populations of claims likely to be fraudulent and take action to recover any benefits paid improperly. This is a rewritten finding from a 2016 OAG audit we conducted, which we reported similar opportunities. USDOL provided guidance to states throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, emphasizing program integrity, and required states to take reasonable and customary precautions to deter and detect fraud, including data mining, data analytics, and various cross-matches. We identified several populations of individuals who received $245 million in likely fraudulent overpayments because they were incarcerated, deceased, above or below the normal age for unemployment compensation benefits, residing in a long-term care facility, or other. As noted on page 14 and 15, UIA had identified some of these questionable payments during our audit period, but did not take action to stop the payments or investigate further, resulting in $1.7 million in payments made after UIA was aware the claimants showed as being incarcerated or deceased. We recommended UIA improve its claim data analysis procedures to identify and recover benefits improperly paid to deceased, incarcerated, or other individuals not normally eligible for unemployment benefits. As noted on page 16, these improvements could help UIA prepare for its upcoming claims software mitigation or migration and be better prepared for future claim spikes. The fourth and final finding, which begins on page 18, relates to the investigation division's benefit payment control, or BPC, unit's actions taken on claims which have been flagged during mandated cross-matches between UIA's claim data and the National Directory of New Hire databases. This cross-match identifies claimants who may not be eligible for unemployment benefits because of other employment they may not have disclosed. As noted on page 18, beginning in the second quarter of 2020, UIA experienced a significant increase in the volume of leads from these cross-matches, which resulted in a significant backlog of claims flagged by UIA which had not been investigated during our audit period. For those flag claims that we did review, as noted in Part A on page 19, UIA had discarded 25% without adjudication because UIA had not addressed programming in MIDAS from the onset of the pandemic, which resulted in certain issues such as these being flagged to be automatically discarded without adjudication. In Part B, we also found BPC staff had improperly closed investigations of flagged issues without fully investigating the time frame the claimants received unemployment benefits. In Part C, we noted that BPC was behind in following up with non-responsive claimants and employers which they're required to follow up with. And in Part D, we noted BPC staff improperly classified closed issued as not ineligible without having received any information to make that classification. This precluded UIA from making a determination of intentional misrepresentation, which further diminished its efforts to identify fraud. As noted on page 19, BPC only required a managerial or secondary level review when they did make a determination of intentional misrepresentation on these types of claims, which they had not determined for these flag claims we reviewed. Also noted on page 19, timely identification and follow-up of these claims is critically important because the MES Act prohibits UIA from addressing the issues identified in these flag claims after 3 years from the date of the first payment. We recommended that UIA improve its processes for investigating leads identified in its cross-matches of new hire database. That concludes our prepared summary of the audit report, and we'd be happy to answer any questions from either committees.
Okay. Thank you both for your presentation to the committee today. So we will open it up for member questions. I have a question that I can start with, and then we'll travel around to our other members, so just give us a wave. I know we're a little spread out today, but just give us a wave if you do have a question, so Wakala as well. Again, thank you both for presenting today. I know you mentioned earlier on in your remarks the unprecedented nature of the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course kind of started and took over the world and this country in particular just over 4 years ago now. And we know that Michigan was not alone in being inundated with these claims during that time. And we know that there were other states that were really, I think, victims of significant fraud and attempted fraud as well. Are you aware of any other states, of what they are doing to kind of correct that, and how Michigan kind of compares to what happened to other states throughout that time? So just looking for some benchmarking there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. We really can't speak to what the other states are doing individually, but, you know, we are aware of turning on internal controls being a relevant factor, having turned them off in the efforts to make payments more expediently. And those are certainly things that, you know, Michigan had done as well. But, you know, to the extent of corrective action or things that the other states are doing, we really can't speak to that.
Okay.
And to any level that we would have compared would not have related to any fraud efforts.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I think we have Representative Kuntz next.
Over here, Madam Chair.
Yep, I got you. Go
I
ahead.
know, I was just-
Looking at the notes here.
Thank you both for coming today. I feel like the Auditor General is the only entity in this entire process that has done their job. You've had 5 reports. We've only had a hearing on 1. And I understand the scope of this report. You've detailed that out. Towards the end, on page 34, there are 7 further items that are not under the scope of this report. And my question today, we've had 5 reports, and every one of them has revealed serious, extensive issues with the unemployment agency. My question to you is, are there further unresolved issues that need to be reviewed? Is there a need for further, unfortunately, nothing has changed yet. Should we continue to look at problems?
Thank you, Representative Kuntz. We had pretty exhaustive scopes for the 5 reports we did. I think we will resume our efforts in a couple of years after the agency has had a chance to implement their new system. To your question, my answer would be I don't know if there are other things that were unresolved that we should continue to look at. We'll know better in a couple of years when we revisit them.
Okay.
Thank you both, and thank you for bringing all these serious issues to light.
Representative Wakala.
Hi, thank you for your work, and I just want to say I think the Auditor General's office is important. But I can't help looking at this and looking at the report, and I have this question, and maybe you can answer it.
Yes.
So in 2 of the findings, you reviewed 25 samples out of 3,042. That's a percentage of 0.007%. And then the other one was 25 out of 65,304, which is much less. I don't do sampling for a living, but it's really hard for me to believe that we would get any real constructive, accurate data from a sample size so low. Can you speak to that and why 25? That's a significantly low number. I think 10% is what you're supposed to sample. That's well below 1%. What was the basis for that?
Sure, I can speak to that a little bit, I think. So we file AICPA guidelines for sampling on our performance audits. And one of the factors is the control structure around the activities that we're auditing. And when we select the sample size, it's based on those guidelines. And when we identify significant error rates, we don't feel it's necessary to pull additional sample items to further quantify the nature of those results. So we felt after the sample sizes that we had pulled, given the level of errors that we noted, that it wouldn't have furthered the cause to identify more. We don't try to project this as a statistically valid sample.
Okay, all set. All right, Representative Hope?
Thank you. Thank you for being here this morning. It seems to me that one thing that we have heard in these various Auditor General reports is that a lot of times the problems seem to arise from short staffing that may have predated a crisis like the pandemic. We know that was the case with the Department of Civil Rights when they came in before our committee and testified. They had woefully inadequate staff for the tasks that they were asked to be doing through no fault of their own. Do you have an opinion about whether the UIA was understaffed before the pandemic?
I don't, Representative. I don't have an opinion on that. We didn't look at staffing levels. What I will say is one of the very first audits we did in this series looked at their personnel, and we know that there was a big influx of contractors based on the perceived need for additional staffing at that time.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Harris, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, thank you both for being here. I think you guys do a fantastic job over there. So you mentioned following up on this in a couple of years. Given the amount of taxpayer dollars we've lost thus far, have we projected future loss of tax dollars if nothing changes between now and then?
We haven't projected on a go-forward basis, but what you'll find in the reports are the numbers that we feel, and we've said it in these different reports, where there's still time to address some of the fraud that occurred and to try to go back for those overpayments. There were vast volumes of some of these populations that hadn't been addressed yet. But those are the numbers we put in the reports, but on a go-forward basis, I wouldn't expect more fraud in terms of at least the federal dollars, because those programs have since ended.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Representative. I have one more question. Can you talk to us about the difference between claims that would have come from individuals versus these scam artist, very sophisticated crime rings that we know are out there? These folks are skilled at what they do. They're skilled at manipulation. They're highly trained, and unfortunately, they're very effective. Does your report differentiate between those two kind of sets of people, individuals versus these scam artist crime rings? Have you taken that into account? Is that something that you feel you are able to differentiate between?
We would have only tried to look at the difference in the samples we selected. We pulled samples of imposter claims, and then we had other samples from claims where various things were misrepresented. But I wouldn't say we did an analysis of each type or who was submitting the fraudulent claims. We looked to see what the department had done to identify some of those folks, and that's basically, I think, finding one in this report.
Okay, thank you.
I can add to that if you don't mind. Related to the differences, the Deloitte report in 2021 did estimate the difference between those two populations, and I believe the population for intentional misrepresentation, which would be the individuals, is about 5.6 billion, and the population of imposter fraud was about 2.8 billion of the about 40 billion paid out total.
Okay, thank you. Representative Breen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize, I had to be somewhere else this morning, so I may have missed this. Was there any accounting for the actual software and technology that the UIA was supplied? It's to my understanding that they have an antiquated system that they've been wanting to upgrade, and that might be finally underway. Is there any accounting for that, and to whether or not that may have hindered some of their work?
We issued a separate report on our audit of the controls over Midas and security access and a variety of other measures, including Midas, around Midas. For this particular report, we certainly were aware of the programming issues within Midas that impacted some of their efforts.
All set? Okay, thank you, Representative Breen.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up on Rep. Breen's question. So with that being said, how long were you aware of just the flaws in the system that we're talking about today? How long were you aware of that? How long was the department aware of the MIDAS system being inadequate?
Well, from our perspective, we didn't find flaws necessarily with the system. It was the programming of the system. So we tried to point out when we became aware of some implications from the programming errors, I'll call them, that were impacting their efforts to address some of the issues we pointed out. So I would say the department themselves were aware before we were of some of the programming issues, and then it became a matter of how the department prioritized trying to address those programming errors or issues. Some of them weren't necessarily errors, Representative. They were just not taking into account all the implications from the variety of programming that needed to be done.
So if I may, Mr. Chair, follow up on that point, then on the programming issues, how long were you aware of that, of the programming issues being inadequate? How long?
Yeah, we started our audit series in late 2020, and from that up until release of this one, we were aware of certain and reported on many of those issues in their various reports.
So in 2020, I'm trying to still get it to the point. I'm sure there were some flaws before 2020, inadequacies with programming, because that's just, it's just hard to believe that these things just, popped up in 2020. So, you guys got to be candid with us here, you're kind of going around the block with us, be candid about that question.
Well, I think part of it, Representative, was the implementation of the CARES Act programs and the standing up these programs that weren't in existence before the pandemic and the variety of tentacles that encompassed. So to get all of the requisite programming into MIDAS, I think, is what became the challenge for the agency at that time. I really can't speak to before the pandemic era what the issues might have been with MIDAS, but that certainly was a challenge after the pandemic started.
Sorry, I can add one thing to that related to finding one, which relates to the intentional misrepresentation and fraud penalties. The errors we had were mostly related to the new programs initiated during the COVID pandemic. The sampled items that we had that we did not note issues with, so we didn't have a 100% error rate. It was around 84%, I believe. Those other ones were the regular UI payments, which it was programmed correct for, and it was accurately assessing those fraud penalties. So it was just the newly added programs, which would have been added in early 2020 during the pandemic, that the programming was incorrect for related to specific issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair.
All right. And last question for Representative Breen.
Thank you. How many times have you audited this agency since 2020?
This is the fifth in a series of audits, excuse me.
Are there any other departments that you've audited this many times in that type of a time frame?
I couldn't answer that, I'm sorry. I don't know. I'd have to go back and look.
That just seems like a really unusual amount. Don't you typically do audits maybe every 7 years on some departments?
Well, the reason we separated this out into 5 separate audits was because of the complexities of what was occurring, complexities of the different respective areas that we audited. We probably could have come in and done 1 or 2 audits and probably taken almost the same amount of time, given the agency was kind of flying the plane at the same time they were working on it. But we kind of segmented them out on purpose, and that's why it resulted in a series of audits. We've certainly done that in the past with other agencies where we would have a series of audits versus 1 or 2 larger audits.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Representative, and thank you both for your presentation and your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right, and now we will transition to the Unemployment Insurance Agency. Again, thank you both. I'd like to now invite up Director Julia Dale with the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunities Unemployment Insurance Agency, along with Legislative Liaison Rachel Wineland, to discuss the work of their team and recent developments. Director Dale and her team will offer a presentation, and then we will take questions at the end.
Good morning, everyone. Before we get started, I hope you might allow me to recognize two individuals. Today happens to be, for those of you who are unaware, Take Your Child to Work Day. There's not many opportunities where someone in my role has the opportunity to share something that might be of interest to their child, but I thought this is a good inside view into how government operates and how we hold each other accountable. So I would like to introduce my daughter, Eva Dale, who is a freshman and is here with us today. So I just want to thank you for allowing me to do that. I also want to recognize the woman that is sitting next to me, Rachel Wineland. Many of you in your offices have worked with Rachel. She has served as the legislative liaison for the UIA since shortly before I came into my role. She bravely joined our team at a time when many people were not excited about joining the UIA, for many of the reasons we've already heard today. She hit the ground running in a way that exuded such grace and courage under fire. This week is her last week with the UIA, and we are happy for her in her newest adventure. She is going to be missed. She has served us so well, and so I just want to publicly acknowledge that, since many of you have worked with her, and just acknowledge how much we have really appreciated her engagement. And what a better way than to serve her last days than next to me today. I do appreciate that. I also want to add, before I get started with my formal remarks, sitting here today, if some of you have heard a little bit about my background, is a full circle moment. And so to have my daughter sitting behind me, I will tell you, as the child of a single mother, who's the first one in her family to go to college, who could never envision a future, sitting in a room like this with all of you, it's a major point of pride, and it's a full circle time for all of us. So thank you. And now I really do want to talk about the very serious matters that we're here to discuss today. Again, Chair Burns, Chair Hadsma, committee members, I do appreciate the opportunity to talk not only about how we are transforming UIA into a national model for fast, fair, and fraud-free service, but also the why. For me, as you may have picked up on, this is as personal as it is professional. I grew up in a broken home, one that my father ruled our family with fear, and as his kids grew older, the abuse escalated from verbal to physical. When my mother left my father, she left with nothing. She worked part-time at McDonald's. She cleaned office buildings before finally landing a union job in our local school district as a custodian, a night custodian. Believe it or not, I soon followed my mother along that same path, and at age 15, literally just months older than my daughter sitting behind me, I was also working in our school, cleaning toilets, scrubbing desks, scrubbing floors. When you lose everything, you shoulder the seismic stigma of poverty, especially when you grow up in a small town where your mother is buying groceries with food stamps and your classmate is bagging them. You learn to cope with the stress of deciding which bills get paid. You learn how to cook Spam and Hamburger Helper, regardless of whether or not you like them. You learn that there is nothing good and there is nothing glamorous about being unemployed or underemployed. I share my story not to gain your sympathy, but to remind you why agencies like ours exist and how the programs you support are often the last resort for good families teetering on disaster. They are our why. The issues raised by the OAG are part of a larger national problem exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic. The reality is, criminals took advantage of a bipartisan push to protect Americans from the very real and personal threat of financial disaster. They stole tens of billions of dollars from U.S. taxpayers and threatened one of this nation's most vital safety nets. At a time when many Americans were struggling to put food on the table, these criminals pursued the opportunity in front of them, no matter the cost. So let's talk about what we have done to fight fraud here in Michigan. The dedicated team we have at the UIA including the nearly 100 staff we have hired specifically to work fraud cases, has recovered more than $90 million since March of 2020. Since then, 162 individuals have been charged, 91 convicted, and 71 sentenced. We take this work very seriously and have partnered with local, state, and federal authorities, as well as the Attorney General's office, to build successful prosecutions. We did this not only by working with law enforcement, but by doubling down on our efforts internally, including putting in place proactive measures to deter, detect, and stop fraud early on. To date, we have fired or otherwise separated 23 UIA employees for violating policies involving potential overpayments. I share with you this so that you know that we fight fraud wherever it occurs, internal or external. We established the Legal and Compliance Bureau and named a legal advisor. We have leveraged our many collaborative anti-fraud practices in the pursuit of bad actors. We implemented new ethics and security clearance policies for every employee and contractor to ensure that the staff adheres to our new stringent requirements and made fingerprinting mandatory for new hires. That is not a norm for state employment. And we are building a new computer system, one for workers and businesses that is easier to use, thus reducing errors and accidental instances of overpayment. We collaborate with the Department of Justice UI Fraud Task Force addressing cyber activity in the UI program and actively engage in monitoring, reporting through the NASWA Integrity Data Hub. Our team recently presented at the Integrity Symposium, and there we were asked to share Michigan's best practices and our successful reforms. In another sign of our national leadership, the Department of Labor has presented Michigan UIA with 6 awards for successful anti-fraud investigations, and our efforts are consistently recognized by the US DOL, which has also given our agency a 100% score 3 years in a row for employer audits. These efforts are part of our larger commitment of innovating and transforming and modernizing the agency. We made the process of applying for benefits and responding to claims easier with the launch of the UIA Claimant Roadmap that we built with the Detroit nonprofit Sevilla. The roadmap was designed by Sevilla following countless hours of interviews and research with workers, worker advocates, and our staff. It is the most utilized tool that we offer, and since its launch in August of 2023, the roadmap has more than 512,000 views and 262,000 unique users, making it the most visited page on our website, second only to our homepage. The roadmap is also the basis for our new first-time filer coaching sessions. These online group sessions walk claimants through applying for benefits and answer questions that they might have along the way. We have had more than 2,000 people sign up for the coaching sessions since we started them last year. In Michigan, the UIA has worked closely on multiple successive audits with the OAG staff over the last 3 years to make sure that we not only identify where we fell short, but we fix issues swiftly and implement lasting reforms. One example. As mentioned in our audits, we are replacing the UIA's antiquated computer system with one that will be easier to use, speed claim processing, and build on the agency's post-pandemic anti-fraud reforms. This modern system, or MyUI as we have since named it, is expected to be online in a year, and it cost about $78 million over the life of a 10-year contract with Deloitte. It is money well spent to build a first-class system that is equipped to quickly handle changing economic conditions and unemployment rates. because of your support, we can make the necessary investments to ensure a modern, accessible UIA, one that is better equipped to meet the expectations of workers and businesses alike in this state. Folks in this room may know from the previous audits, the several previous audits and hearings, that the Snyder-era system we had in place during the COVID-19 pandemic was not remotely equipped to handle the massive influx of needs. The system not only failed workers during the crisis, but prior to the crisis had a 93% error rate in making false fraud findings. This meant that we were not only dealing with fighting fraud, but we were fighting accusations of fraud prior to the pandemic in a system that had no basis in reality. Recently, we settled a lawsuit because of the false fraud findings from a faulty system. Transforming the UIA means doing things the right way. Like I said earlier, we aren't looking for quick fixes. We are driving for lasting change. This means out with the old way of doing things and in with the new. At the UIA, we are gaining momentum, and we have more innovative reforms on the horizon. We also established a modernization work group, a first-of-its-kind task force made up of representatives from Michigan's labor, business, and jobless advocacy organizations. They are there to advise the agency on significant improvements and how it can better serve Michigan workers and employers, and to troubleshoot new technologies and services to ensure that they are as effective and efficient as possible. The work group recently marked its first anniversary and pays tribute to the power of relationships. What may have first been an unlikely and tenuous gathering has delved into a treasure trove of thought leadership and collaboration. Because of the work group, the UIA has connected more richly with our stakeholders and had the opportunity to engage face to face, not only with these leaders, but with their memberships. When we take the time, you see, to know each other and our respective goals, it is easier to build trust and to get things done. In a recent work group meeting, the members were joined by our Deloitte change management team and provided valuable feedback as we talked about how we can best prepare and communicate with those we serve about the launch of MyUI. This feedback was converted into actionable steps the UIA and Deloitte are already working on. Fighting fraud isn't our only focus. There are people and businesses across our state who need help, who need and deserve support from our agency, and we are able to provide it. We were awarded a $6.5 million grant from the U.S. Department of Labor to support equitable access to jobless benefits by removing barriers related to race, language, ethnicity, age, disability status, and geography. With this grant, we built and launched the Community Connect program. We have 10 liaisons working in designated regions across the state. They are there to be a resource and to help solve issues in underserved communities across the state. At the UIA, we believe that when we go on-site into these communities, into your communities, we gain valuable insight about the barriers they face, about the barriers people experience. We are partnering with local elected officials, municipalities, libraries, union halls, faith-based organizations, and more to provide on-the-ground support for folks who need it most. Each week, we are meeting with stakeholders and identifying new opportunities to connect with those we serve through this initiative. In some instances, the liaison's work could be as simple as letting folks know they need to show proof of employment authorization and wages during certain work periods to qualify for benefits. In others, it means working with employers in their region by reaching out to their workforces in the event of layoffs, connecting employers to UIA programs, and answering questions on unemployment. This works because our team is meeting people, your constituents, where they are. In Flint, program representatives attended the Latinx Technology and Community Center to share the services we provide, such as language assistance, interpreters, and help with claim filing and job-seeking resources. Recently, I was in Traverse City and stopped in at the East Bay Branch Library, where Autumn, one of our liaisons, was hosting an event. This innovation for a pop-up at the local branch started with Autumn presenting to the Rotary Club of Petoskey. From there, she was connected with the local libraries and then the Northern Library Cooperative. Autumn was then invited to provide a UIA Navigator training session, and one of the librarians who participated in that training encouraged and invited Autumn to come to that East Bay Branch Library. Earlier that morning, before I had stopped into the library, Autumn was able to assist a young man with autism. He had traveled to the library with his father. For this young man, navigating the process online had been difficult and it had been frustrating. Our pop-ups with the liaisons allow for longer in-person meetings with staff who can handle any issue on a claim that they might run into. The father and son found the experience helpful, welcoming, and far easier to navigate with that in-person support that Autumn was able to provide. Recently, I learned about the specific challenges those with autism face when it comes to unemployment. I am proud that we, as an agency, have identified opportunities to support folks across the spectrum and work to tackle those barriers. This is the type of real, on-the-ground work our Community Connect program is doing. And to date, our Community Connect program has provided support in 69 counties and 106 municipalities and helped hundreds of individuals. Our plan is to be active in all 83 counties in Michigan by the end of the year. And I would welcome the opportunity to partner with any of your communities and constituents if we have not already done so. At the UIA, we know that geography can be a barrier in accessing benefits. Whether struggling with internet access or the distance to a UIA office, we are exploring additional options to make it easier for people to provide verification to the UIA. This includes a partnership with the United States Postal Service, funded by the U.S. Department of Labor. This partnership will allow folks who need to verify their identity in person to do so at a USPS branch, instead of making an appointment at a UIA office that might not be as convenient for them. This innovative partnership will make it easier for residents in rural communities, as well as seasonal and agricultural workers, to access services more easily and will help the agency root out any instances of fraud more efficiently by having that identification done in person. We continued our work with Sevilla to build the Employer Help Center on our website as a one-stop shop for business owners, a place where they can submit reports, manage claims, and find additional resources and answers they need. We have also been working with the Small Business Association of Michigan, not just via their partnership through the Modernization Work Group, but we work collaboratively with them to ensure we are providing small businesses in our state with the resources they need and to ensure that our regularly held employer seminars are as effective as possible. The bottom line, Michigan workers should be able to apply for benefits with confidence so that they can support their families and focus on getting back to work without worrying about when or if those benefits will hit their bank account. Michigan businesses should be able to pay taxes and file reports seamlessly without delay or complications, especially small businesses who certainly don't have countless hours to spend navigating unemployment insurance online. A note on the process that brought us here. We welcome the OAG's oversight on past performance, and I hope this will end the conversation on the pandemic era. The UIA is driving Michigan forward for both workers and employers. Nobody is served if we continue to rehash the past and lose focus on the future. To close the loop, let me thank you. Your support has allowed the UIA to be a national leader in fighting fraud. Your support is enabling the UIA to replace an outdated computer system with a modern iteration that will be easier to use and harder to exploit. Your support has helped UIA be better connected to your communities. And finally, your support has helped us grow the trust fund that finances Michigan's unemployment insurance program to a robust $2.3 billion. Behind every unemployment claim is a person. It might be a single mother leaving an abusive home with poor employment prospects, or a teenage girl washing floors and scrubbing toilets. Or it might be an entire young family surviving on Hamburger Helper and food stamps. We are here today to help people in their darkest hours, because for most Michiganders forced out of a job and into crisis, we are their last and their best hope. I take this work very personally, as does the entire UIA. I know all of you do too. I am happy to answer any questions you might have for me.
Thank you, Director Dale. Thank you for looking forward, and thanks for your transformational activities and describing those transformational activities. You mentioned in your conclusion the support that the legislature has afforded the UIA in fixing things that didn't work a long time ago. So what might we do going forward as a legislature to ensure that you have additional support to ensure that the MES Act is being properly administered?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I think, as always, with any agency, there are many opportunities, I think, for us to partner moving forward. I'm very proud of our Community Connect program, so let me highlight that first. If there is any opportunity where we can partner with your offices, with your constituents, whether it's on the business side or the worker side, please reach out to us, because we know that when it comes to serving people, that one-to-one engagement is vitally important. So I want to just reiterate that message if that wasn't received. There's many opportunities, I think, under the MES Act. We're looking at how do we modernize it. There's certainly some cleanup that can occur. I'm in my 24th year in state government. I've worked in 5 of the principal departments, and I don't think I've yet to see a statute that might not be able to have a little bit of cleanup in the agencies that I've worked in over the last 2 decades. And so I think there's opportunity there. I think especially, and I know that I've brought this up before, when it comes to the waiver programs and providing guidance there about how those waivers might be issued. There had been some amendments to that in the early 2010s, and I think there's opportunity to reevaluate that. I think the other thing to keep in mind is how do we partner together and communicate? The Modernization Work Group has been a tremendous tool for us to engage, whether we're talking about policies, we're talking about processes, we're talking about specific community concerns. You know, I did mention SBAM, but we also work closely with the Michigan Manufacturing Association as well as labor representatives. And so I think to the extent that you within the legislature can continue to help us facilitate that. And I think allowing us to continue to provide the support and resources when it comes to fighting fraud. This initiative that we are exploring with the United States Postal Service is an exciting opportunity. 7 states have taken advantage of this so far. It's one that we are evaluating and balancing the timing of. As everyone is aware, we are in the midst of a new system, and so trying to figure out when might be the best time to implement that.
Thank you. Representative Kolazar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today. I'm sure every colleague of mine that was here during the onset of the pandemic remembers the difficult time of being on the phone with our constituents till well into the evening, every weekend, talking to some very frightened and frustrated people. And so my question is if, heaven forbid, and again, I know obviously you're obviously same conversations going on, if heaven forbid we have another crisis like that, what makes you most confident that this time it would look a whole lot different, and this time UIA could handle that level, that scale of need?
There are several things that give me confidence should something like that happen. First, let me say, I was, when I came in, the 11th director in as many years. When you have that kind of turnover in leadership, it impacts what happens within the agency. You have everyone kind of moving to their own divisions and trying to do the best they can, but without reoccurring leadership that sets the tone, that sets expectations, that's able to tackle issues like system failures and system problems, then you're left with each individual division leader trying to fend for themselves essentially in the work of their division. So with my consistent leadership, we have been able to tackle some major problems head on. First of all, I have implemented IT systems before. I have worked with DTMB and vendors before, and they all know I am not one of those directors that sits behind the table and is not engaged. I am very much involved. I will tell you that even when it came to negotiating for our new system, I sat in those negotiations because I wanted to make sure that our partner knew that if you were going to come and work with us, you better come to the table prepared because our expectations are high and we can't afford to have what happened in the past happen again. And so one, it is the approach that I brought, I think, to that and that leadership. The other thing is that we recognized that there needed to be some change management. And so we brought in an individual that used to manage that portfolio of work, the LPI work at DTMB, and I brought that individual sitting behind me as my chief of staff. And so we built a team, and we've gone into each area, and we said, okay, what is our clearance process for reviewing documents? What is our process for this? And we are doing these internal reviews proactively and saying, okay, let's document these. Let's put systems and processes in place, because also the idea is, at the end of the day, one day I will walk out those doors and will not be sitting in the director chair. What I am not looking to create is a cult of personality so that when the director leaves, it falls apart again. What we are doing is building muscle memory and accountability and ownership and systems and processes that are well documented and detailed so that people know what their responsibility is and what they need to do when things go wrong. And, we are working, for instance, with Sevilla. We are, to make our communications easier to understand. We know much of the criticism was, we can't understand what's being said. We don't know what this letter means. I shouldn't need a law degree to interpret this. I have a law degree and struggled with some of these letters. We also said, all right, we have the contractors out of here. Let's start training all of our individuals. Let's implement a gold star customer training. And we did that first with all of our staff that were customer facing. Because what I expect is excellence in my agency. I expect excellence of my team. I expect excellence of myself. And I do believe we can have excellence in government. And I think it's that expectation and those reforms that has put us on the right path.
Thank you. Representative Menser.
Thank you, Chair. In 2016, your unemployment system identified 20,000 people as fraudulently collecting unemployment. That was false. You have an employee, it sounds to me like you're trying to replace a 10-year-old computer system that was supposed to last 30 years with another system. Number one, how do I know that system is going to be any better than 20,000 people losing their unemployment because unemployment was incorrect, was falsely, these people were falsely. And what are you going to do about the employer that fraudulently claims that these employees are a certain kind of worker so that they can, so that they can avoid paying? Mm-hmm. And you brought up seasonal ag workers. I spent 13 years in landscape contracting. Every year, I would lay off people at the end of December, the end of November, the beginning of December. But every year, I would bring those people back because they were highly skilled, highly trained, and I wanted a workforce that was familiar and that came back every year. What are you going to do to make it easier for these seasonal workers to come back? They shouldn't have to be applying for jobs at McDonald's when I know that within 3 months, I am bringing them back to work. So I have some severe questions about the accuracy and the user interface and the human intervention in the computer program that you're putting together right now?
I think those are very fair questions. Let me start with the first one related to the system. One of the things that we are all across the UIA and within DTMB, because you don't implement a system in the state without working closely with our partners at DTMB and also Deloitte is aware of, is that there is a high level of accountability that needs to exist. And this is a high stakes game for UIA because of the history of failing systems that have had those false fraud findings. And while I wasn't in this seat when that occurred, I was in this seat when we negotiated those settlement agreements, and I'm very aware of those personal stories of how people were impacted. And so what I can tell you is we have very clear communications with Deloitte, our vendor, about what those expectations are. As a matter of fact, Deloitte has their own internal audit process, and I just sat down with them where they sit across the table from me and they say, how do you feel like the process is going? How do you feel like the customer services? How do you feel about the progress? And I spoke very highly of the experience I had, but what I also said to them was this: Michigan is not New Mexico, and we're not Colorado. So I don't care what you did in New Mexico, and I don't care what you did in Colorado. What you did there is not going to be sufficient for what we need you to do here. The bar is higher, the expectation is higher, and you have a leader that is going to hold that expectation firm and stand firm to that line. And we've talked about how do we partner and how do we aim for what is better and not just what's already been done. And that's what we're doing through business design, through requirements. We'll do it through testing. And we are entering this process with a two-phased approach because we know if we were going to try to do this in one fell swoop, the system is just too big. So we're starting in two segments. We're starting with one release that'll focus on tax and employer issues. And then months later, there'll be a second release that focuses on the claims. And what that allows us to do is keep our attention focused on the ball in front of us. Let's do one thing well before we go on to the next thing. When it comes to seasonal and agricultural workers, I will say, as a woman of Mexican-American descent who grew up in a community where there were a lot of migrant farm workers, that is something that resonates with me and agricultural workers quite dearly. I recently engaged with the training that Leo provides to their seasonal farm work services staff and talked about my experience and the work that we are doing at the UIA. One of the things that we were able to do with the U.S. Department of Labor grant money is start a language translation initiative. And in that initiative, we are looking at providing seminars in Spanish language so that we can make those available. Our forms, our websites, we are looking through this grant money to update to Spanish language as well so that they're easily understood, not just for those who English is their first language, but those who also speak Spanish. We are also going to be focusing on our top 10 forms in the top 10 languages that are spoken in Michigan and making sure that all of those top 10 forms can be available in those top 10 languages. And then going back to the issue of seasonal workers who may have a recall date, right? Because they go back to that same employer year after year, but they have that seasonal period off. One of the things is I was actually talking with some of our seasonal workers team about the U.S. Postal Service initiative is that it makes it very difficult when those seasonal workers leave Michigan. They've got a recall date, and they go back to Texas or they go wherever they go, and then they get a thing saying, well, you've got to go participate in this seminar, or we need you to come to Michigan to verify your identity. With the United States Postal Service program, and a person who has applied for unemployment, whether they're in Michigan or Ohio or Texas, could go into any branch office that offers that service and verify their identity, again, reducing our risk of fraud and making our services that much more accessible. You know, one of the things that was quite interesting is I live in a small town a little bit here, and I said, hey, can you check my zip code and tell me if the little salt box postal office in my town would offer that service? And they checked it, and they said, sure would. You could go ahead and verify your identity if you lived in that town.
Thank you. Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Director, thank you for your candor. And also, thank you for sharing your story. And thank you for answering my question in terms of the system, how long the problems have plagued us. You mentioned inadequate system prior to the pandemic. That's what I was trying to figure out. Thank you for answering that. And also the outdated system, the faulty system. And then, I really appreciate the fact that you address creating a team and having an approach of, working on maximizing and mastering one part of the puzzle before you go on. So I feel very confident that, we won't be in the same place next year based on what I heard. And I can feel the level of commitment and in your voice and just your expansion of explaining the process and what you expect. Everything rises and falls upon leadership. And that is true for everything. And so, so thank you. And to your daughter, thank you for being here. You're getting a chance to see and welcome, and you're getting a chance to see how things are done in the government. And so hopefully you aspire after your mom. She's a great example for you. And good luck to you in your education endeavors. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. Representative Mueller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know you're the new director, but could you tell us where these people came from that they were hiring? Did they do extensive background checks? When you consider that people are giving personal information that'd be ripe for identity theft, a lot of people are working from home, which I understand because of the pandemic. You've mentioned a lot about the system before you got there. My predecessor, Representative Joe Graves, was chair of oversight, and they've been dealing with this since 2012. So knowing that there's been a problem since that time all the way up to now, it looks like you're going to try to handle the situation, but what can we do to prevent people that shouldn't be in the job doing the job? And secondly, was there outside resources that could have been available to use at the onset of the pandemic with people that had the experience with accounting and things like that that offered to help the state that was turned down?
Mm-hmm. First, let me answer your question related to where did the additional staff come from? So during the pandemic period when there was this quick ramp up, and let me give you a staff, I think someone asked about staffing levels and I can provide a little bit of context. So at the beginning of currently, let me start present. Presently, we have 726 roughly full-time employees at the UIA. At the start of the pandemic, at the start of the Snyder era, there were 1,500. By the time the pandemic started, we were at half of that staffing level. So just to provide some context about resources. When it came to fighting fraud, our fraud division at the start of the pandemic was roughly 34 staff. That 102 or so number that you saw published is because I have approximately 70 limited term staff augmenting my investigations team. So when they needed to staff up quickly, as every state did, then the agency went to external contractors who were brought in to answer phone. These are people that didn't have UI experience, who were brought in to answer phones. And not only were they used, we know that, people across Leo answered phones, and, I know Rachel responded to calls, everybody responded to calls, but those large numbers were contractors that were brought in. And this was referenced in one of the earlier audits, the personnel management, but they did not do background checks. And so I think that answers the first part of your question.
So you as a new director, what have you done to ensure that proper background checks are going to be done when people are handling sensitive information? Sure. Especially today, it's running wild just because of technology with the fraud, with identity theft. Absolutely.
So I think first things first is that we offboarded the contractors, all of them, not long after I started my tenure with UIA. And we implemented new ethics policies. And what those ethics policies say is that if you have access, if you're going to work with UIA, you're going to have to sign this policy. You're going to get a background check, not just the regular state background check, but fingerprinting. So if you don't know, employment in state government for most positions is that you have a background check, a regular criminal background check. It's not a fingerprinting check. So it really just kind of operates in the general Michigan area. We went back, worked with the union, because certainly we have union, most of our staff are union staff, and talked about the concerns we have. And we went back and fingerprinted every single one of our staff and looked at those results. And then what we said is going forward as a term of employment with UIA, you will be required before you are hired to go through a fingerprinting background check. And we also take those same standards to our contractors.
Really quick, Mitch, just one quick follow-up. So with these contractors, are you going to allow contractors from out of state, or are all the contractors going to be in-state, and the people going to be doing these checks, and the employees going to be from the state of Michigan, or can you do this, work from home, and live in another state?
No, that's a great question. And so let me be clear, the contractors that we are using now are only related to our IT vendors that are coming through. So it is not the staff that are working claims, accessing the system. Those are all our either limited term staff that are here in Michigan, they're hired, into the state, going through all those hiring processes and trainings, or they are our full-time staff. The contractors we have now are just those that are on board for our work that we do with Deloitte.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, we have 3 questions from ethics members, and we've got less than 10 minutes to go. So I'm going to ask everybody to get right down to it with your question. And Director, if you could also, we appreciate all the information you're sharing. We just need everybody to be really succinct so we can get to everyone. So with that, Rep. Harris, please go ahead.
I have a question from Representative Waddell after they're done.
Okay.
So be
Thank-
more succinct.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Director, thank you for being here. I know you have a hard job. I think we all realize that, especially coming into the state of affairs that you did. I'd love to answer or ask questions of your predecessor, but I can't. There's an NDA, so I can't even talk to him. So with that, I know you're trying to right the ship, but you do have the rudder now. So I know we've talked about problems in the past, but I have a huge list of recent complaints from constituents about how horrible the system is or how they can't get through to a live person. The UIA still continues to be one of the top complaints that we get in our offices, many of our offices. And so I want to focus now on the present day and the future. So how can, if our responsibility is oversight, and we know that we've had constant turnover with directors, the citizens are going to stop blaming the fact that we're just having turnover. They're going to start blaming us for not holding UIA accountable. So with that, and with this still being a major issue today, what assurances can we give back to our people? And what are your suggestions on how we can hold UIA or the directors accountable for failures? And then what do we do if those things are not fixed over this next year?
Great question. I think there's a couple things. First, what's important to know is that many of the staff that I'm using, right now I have about 100 to 130 limited term staff that I'm using to augment the staff that I have now. Our customers have a high expectation, and they should. The reality is, though, we have a limited amount of resources. And at some point, that federal grant money that I have, that I'm able to fund these additional staff with, is going to go. The UIA has a limited number of resources. And so we just added 30 new staff to take on phones as we're working on the new system. So I think it's a partnership to say, as the chairs did earlier, how do we partner together to support you? Because I want look, in the day of Amazon, we all expect a certain level of customer service, and they should. But we also need to have the tools to be able to provide that level of customer service. And that continues to be a bit of a struggle for us. There are many things that we have to tackle. I can tackle a new system and put staff on there, and I can put staff on the phones. And at some point, we are constantly working to say, how do we better meet your customers' needs? If we come out with a Community Connect team to address some of the specific complaints your constituents are raising, I think that would be a great first step. I think that would be a wonderful opportunity.
Thank you, Director Dale. Representative, we do have to move on. I apologize. We've got about 5 minutes left. We have a committee coming in at 10:30. I would encourage folks, if there are additional questions that we're not able to get to today, to please continue the conversation with the director. I wish we had more time. I apologize. Next up, Representative Wozniak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate your enthusiasm, Director, but I look at your department as one of those proverbial freighters going down the river, 1,000-foot freighter, and you're trying to turn it. It takes a while. So I appreciate your efforts on that. Obviously, the previous results from years before are terrible. But I'm looking forward to improvement in there. But I would like to ask you about your relationship with the AG's office and the monthly meetings that have been going on. and hiring a legal advisor and legal compliance director to bring everything together, and then the fraud standard referrals that you're going to have. So if you could sum that up quickly.
Yes, so what we recognize is that, in prior roles in state government, you always have a DSA, an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding has been my experience with the Attorney General's office. So that way, the agency that's referring cases has clear expectations for reporting, how referrals work, training, how cases are handled. We recently just got those documented and signed in working with the Criminal Division of the Attorney General's office. Having served as an AAG and having also been a bureau director in other agencies, that process and building that relationship and referrals is going to go a long way for us expediting the process of moving forward with fraud prosecutions and any other criminal cases we may have.
Thank you, Director. Representative Breen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for sharing your story about your personal life. In my prior life, during the Snyder era, I was a practicing attorney. I did mostly workers' compensation. It's where I met Representative Hadsma, actually. And a lot of these folks also had significant issues with unemployment. And to reflect upon what some of my colleagues have said, we're talking about a 93% error rate. Over 20,000 erroneous accusations. People went into bankruptcy. They had their homes taken. They were severely wronged and penalized. It's to my understanding, this is a system that you inherited, essentially setting you up to fail during the pandemic. And we want to talk about moving forward. And I am very happy to see that you are at long last able to take action and rectify these issues that arose not only during the pandemic, but were in fact made obvious during the Snyder era, and you were hamstrung, from what I understand, by this system, and you've been wanting to move forward. And so as we look forward, this is actually my question. This system that you inherited, did a third-party contractor own the system and the code and set it up? And if that's the case, did that even further hamstring your department, and how can we avoid this in the future?
It's very astute because I think it's an important distinction about systems, and this is just my own personal view in state government. Fast Enterprises is the current vendor that we have, and they have what I would call a black box system, which means at the end of the day, when we go live with the new system, we have to have them there until we're done because they take their ball and they go home. They pack up their system and they take it with you. And so when we need changes to the system, DTMB staff, my staff, don't have access to see behind the curtain. We don't get to see what Oz is doing. We have to depend on them, on their estimates, and on what they're going to do. And that is a challenge, and that is something that I swore we would not find ourselves in with the new system. We own it. We have control. We have ownership over when changes need to be made.
Thank you. That clarifies a lot, and I appreciate that you are going to be able to avoid that problem in the future.
Representative Wagella, quickly.
Yes. So I just want to be clear. I think it's really critical that we fund the department to make sure that these services are done effectively. And I think we all can agree that fraud should not happen, et cetera. But I kind of want to make a little point and then ask your opinion on it. You know, the IRS is talking right now that they suggest that millionaire tax evasion is reaching $150 billion a year. I bring this up because when we're talking about people cheating systems, and we're talking about auditing departments, I'm not saying that we shouldn't audit the UIA or we shouldn't make sure there's no fraud, but I'm curious when we look at this, and maybe this was a question for the Auditor General, but maybe you can answer it. What is the average rate of when there is a fraud claim, how much is that, what's that number? How long does it take to investigate? And then what is the budget, your budget, spend each year on fraud investigation? Because I think it's an important question for resources. If we're looking to recruit money and revenue to the state, are we going after, fraud cases that are not going to get the return of an investment, or should we be helping the IRS go after millionaire tax evaders?
So that's a great question. So as I mentioned earlier, we have roughly 33 fraud investigation staff. And we have 70 limited term staff to augment that I have funding for through the end of this year, through December roughly. And so our staff there compared to the hundreds of staff I have in the claimants side and the benefits, it's very lopsided when we think about the efforts. What I will say as well is that our fraud expense, when we think about cases that we refer over, because not every case is going to criminal prosecution, whether we're talking about the Attorney General's office or the Department of Justice, they have limited resources as well. And so they're going to say, what is the opportunity that is going to allow us to get the biggest bang for the buck? Like, do you go after the individual that's got 5,000 here or 3,000 there, or do you go after the ring that is several million? And so that is something that we have to consider when we think about what cases do we pursue and do we move forward. There is always opportunity, to pursue fraud. It is also, though, about me and our leadership team thinking about how do we manage the financial resources that we have best, and where do we get the best return on tax dollars in what cases we refer or pursue.
There being no further business before this Labor Committee.
One more
Labor Committee's
question?
adjourned.
One more question, Mr. Chair?
We are just about at time, so we do have to go ahead and wrap up. As I mentioned earlier, I would encourage all of our members, if they have ongoing questions for the Director or Auditor General, to have those conversations. Thank you, Director Dale, and everyone for presenting today. There being no further business before this joint committee, we are adjourned.